present to us in any way that you see fit.
Ko taratahi te mauna, ko ati whakatū te awa, ko Southern Cross tōku waka, ko Pākehā tōku iwi, ko Taikura tōku marae, ko John Rawa, ko Isabel Millington o ku mātua, tōku toru a ku tamariki, ko Sona me Lucy me Timo o ku tamariki, ko Sarah Millington tōku ingoa.
Kia ora.
So I stand here as a layperson, having studied freshwater ecology decades ago at Otago University for my honours.
So did you do that research when you were 10 years old, did you?
That's very charming, thank you very much. And currently teach as a social sciences teacher in a local secondary school. I walk the waterways and with my ecological lenses see deterioration of the waterways that really saddens me. And with my social sciences hat on, my lenses are also very much shaped by social justice. And so, yeah, I stand here unable to deliver evidence and startling science to you, but I hope that my heart's truth will, persuade you to place ecological values and social justice values very firmly in the front and centre of your tank plan decisions. On the radio today, I heard a song, It's a Crying Shame, the World We Live Where Money is King, sang Lee Fields. And I would add to that short-term thinking as well. What I saw in the proposed tank plan was that it prioritised the security of water supply for economic activity over long-term health and well-being of these freshwater resources. I've since seen a number of submissions that are asking for even more opportunities to exploit the water for economic ends. And for example, in asking you to alter the definition of actual and reasonable use to allow for further expansion of irrigated areas and further water takes. And when consent renewals come up, for example. And I didn't see climate change and increasing drought taken into account in these submissions, and nor really in the tank plan as proposed at this stage. On the other hand, I see that the waterways are making it abundantly clear with how they present that the water is already over-allocated and already overused. We see this in dry stream beds and dead eels and dry wells and sick dogs and unswimmable rivers. And I really think it behoves us to ensure that the tank plan addresses all of these issues and does what it can to address over-allocation, overuse, land use. So I urge you as guardians of these waterways in your decision-making role, that you're in a position to make pivotal decisions on the health and well-being of this catchment area. And so I urge you to take, please, a very precautionary approach in the setting of objectives and policies and targets in regards to water quality, water quantity and land use in the tank catchment. I think the tank plan also must ensure that there is really strong regulation and monitoring and enforcement by the council and tangata whenua to make sure that land users and water users are operating within the plan boundaries. My written submission contains recommendations that focus on sustainable management of the catchments to these ends. The other main focus of my written submission was to state what I see as the fundamentally important role of tangata whenua in managing the tank catchment. Ngāti Kahununu's relationship with these awa and this catchment span many, many, many centuries, way more than the Pākehā who share this catchment area now. And the Matauranga Māori of this relating to the tank area that has been developed and accumulated over that time is of incredible and fundamental value to the sustainable management of this catchment. Furthermore, the Council is obliged to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, as stated in the National Policy Statement for Freshwater, and I believe the best way to do this is to set up a co-management model for the tank catchment in which tangata whenua are equal partners in the co-management model, and to include in the tank plan an explicit framework for how this co-management would be implemented. Co-management means true joint decision making. It's representative, it draws on traditional knowledge, and it allows and enables the exercising of kaitiakitanga and rangatiratanga. And my written submission makes recommendations to this effect. As I say, I come to speak generalisations and remind you of values that I'm sure that you hold. I'm aware that I'm very short on detail, but there are many experts at your disposal who can provide that, and I only hope that I've reminded you of these fundamental values to ensuring the well-being of the whenua and the wai and the tangata of Heretaunga now and for the next 7 generations. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā kātou katoa.
Kia ora, Ms Millington. We may have some questions for you. Certainly I have a couple of them. Whereabouts do you live?
Hastings.
In Hastings. And in your original submission and today you've said that you walk along and you swim and paddle in the rivers. Which particular rivers are you
Actually,
referring to?
I very rarely swim in the rivers here because it's the yuck. As a child, I swim in rivers.
Okay.
I wish very dearly that my children could go and swim whenever they can. We swim at Marae Tōtara. We paddle in all of the local rivers, but swimming doesn't happen so often.
Okay. And I'm just asking you for a little bit to put on your ecology and social science classes, and just give us a view of what you see has been changing while you've been living here. What's the changes, or what's the degradation that you're talking about? What does that look like?
So the murkiness in the rivers, seeing cows going down banks in the rivers, seeing dehydrated eels lying in dry stream beds, seeing all of the sediment that washes out into the bay after rain. These things, that shouldn't be happening either. Seeing that people have to truck in water to their homes because their wells are dry. Seeing all these massive irrigation, I'm not sure what, spivitas, sprinklers, the big ones with wheels that go through, and yeah, boom, right, thank you. Which have, there are no trees or very little vegetation in these areas, and so there are then no tree roots to hold the water there. The water is just simply being mined out of the aquifer. Then I see graphs that experts, using have put together that illustrate the increasing use of water. And particularly the increase in the amount of water being drawn for irrigation over the last 20 or 30 years. Irrigation or ditches full of yucky weed that shouldn't be there. These are not markers of healthy, functioning ecosystems.
Thank you. See if we've got any other questions.
No, that's very interesting, thanks. Just curious to know who your supervisor was for your honours degree.
Oh, Professor Caroline Burns, who's actually just was on the Queen's birthday list.
Yes.
Yeah,
Oh, very
that
good.
was wonderful. Honour of her amazing work. Yeah.
Thank you.
You had a very good teacher then.
Caroline.
You raised an issue here that I agree with you in that climate change doesn't seem to be extensively or well covered in the thinking around climate change now. Can you elaborate a bit more on why you think that's so?
Why I think it hasn't been covered?
What's the impact? If it isn't being realistically targeted and focused on, what would that mean?
Well, I think the implication is that we're not preparing the tank catchment for the increasing periods of drought, and possibly also for extreme weather events like big floods and so on. But if water is continuing to be over allocated and overused on the basis of a 10-year average, when resource consents come up for renewal, for example, then that's not looking further down the track where there isn't going to be probably as much rainfall to replenish the waters. So when a resource consent renewal occurs and the maximum allowable take, for example, is not reduced, or the total volume across the catchment area of water take, if that is not reduced, if it's maintained or even increased, then what we're going to get is increasing incidences of dry streams, dry wells, not enough water, degraded, destroyed ecosystems. And certainly we're not going to get anywhere near swimmable rivers.
And just one quick question on the issue of co-management that you've raised. Do you have any examples of where co-management of this kind operates and works at the moment?
So I can point you to a paper by a young woman called Rose Ann Ellis, I think her name was, sorry, that she did at Lincoln University in 2015. Rose Davies, I beg your pardon, Māori and Freshwater Co-Management Agreements. It was a study on 3 co-management agreements and how it was a comparative study of how that sort of worked out. So no, I can't give you any specific detail, but I can point you towards that paper, Māori and Freshwater, by Annalise Rose Davies, 2015. So I acknowledge that it could be that this is this would be pioneering for the council. There aren't that many co-management models yet, as I understand, but I don't see that a reason not to go ahead and do it. I think that this is the way of the future. This is what needs to happen.
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge. Let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ms. Millington. And just checking to see if we've got Hope monitoring, Stephen Randall. No, we're a little bit ahead of, we're 10 minutes ahead of schedule. Mr. Randall?
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Right.
I'm on here on behalf of the Kaitiaki of Omahi, the Ngāroroa Hawa, and other issues with the councils and all that. But anyway, my name's Stephen Randall, whakaiingoa, kia ora whānau. It's a sort of an issue about monitoring is what my main aim is at, is recognising all of our resources is our wai, whenua, whānau, whakapapa, and so on, what's going on about this partnership and treaty settlements that have been going on about whose it is and whose it was, who's it now. And it's a big issue, but a bit at a time. Our group's doing all right at Omahu with other maraes around, which want to work together. As with our neighbouring hapu, I'm an owner out at Ngā Tarawa. I don't know how many owners here at Ngā Tarawa. I'm also across Ohiti, also Runanga and over Taipi. So really that I whakapapa across the awa, roto and the maunga to our Ngāti neighbouring whānau Ngāti Henimanu, Ngāti Paki, Ngāti Henimanu, Ngāti Tiu Pokairi. And that's why I sort of, on both sides of the awa, is that I've got a Pākehā name, but I'm not getting recognised. And I do have a Māori name that's not getting recognised either within the systems, within what it is today. And I can't blame the Pākehā and I can't blame the Māoris because they're running new generations. That is who we are tangata whenua. And I believe we come from here and we're going to go back to it. So, and the whole idea of this tautoko and this our group, Kaitiaki, is Omahu, they're staunch. Well, we're still not getting recognised. And I like to take all the others, and I also whakapapa to Waikato, which is Tānui, and why is everyone struggling with what's happening to our resources? Yeah, I'd just like to see better systems happening because I've been to many of these huis. This is the only korero I've had, really, to all of them. And I can't see why there's so many huis over the same blocks, the same things. Where does it end? Where do we unite? It's like the Waipuruku, the meeting place of waters. Where do we meet? Mangaro. All these sort of issues, and we were at the Marae Mangaro not long ago, and I had issues there with owners, you know. And but anyway, getting back onto the track, I'd just like to take all of those who's trying to protect what's ours and forever. Kia ora.
Thank you, Mr. Randall. The organisation you had on your submission is Hope Monitoring. Is it a particular role that you have in monitoring rivers, is it?
Well, it was mainly to do with the wires because we did a course in management on Eka tuna,
Oh, yes.
kaimona, all that sort of stuff, and water. And it came under the management Māori customary rights or something. Well, that didn't take me into a job either.
You refer to mātauranga, using mātauranga Māori alongside Western science. Can you elaborate on that? Can you just give us a bit more about what you mean there?
Well, my grandfather's name is Awa. Awa Ranana. So the names of my tipunas of what we're trying to put across what was ours isn't ours. Whether you wanted the more scientifically way of kōrero about it, or
I suppose I was looking for examples of where you might have used that approach already. I mean, with your business, Hope Monitoring, and
well, it's
which I'm assuming is underpinned by mātauranga Māori and tikanga and all that sort of stuff.
to create jobs is the main thing.
Yeah.
Mahi.
But alongside it is this Western science that people struggle with, like it is, I guess, with mātauranga Māori. And so the bringing together of those two is not always an easy thing.
No.
Yeah. And I just wondered whether you could give us some examples of where you might have done that and succeeded, and tell us how you succeeded.
I was just going back into the past when you look back into Hurricane Bowler. Came in and bowled us over. It's all about experience of what we've been through and what's to come.
What did you do yourself?
Well, it's like the earthquake. What do you do when there's an earthquake? It's similar, you know, you just got to change or adapt or monitor as part of the changing to whatever the climate change.
Yeah, so that was the sort of thing you did. I'm just trying to get more of a feel for what you actually do.
Well, I was trying to create a monitoring group so that we can monitor the water like regional council and be a part of their main
Yeah.
to kaitiagis to our own resources.
Did you ever get to a point where you'll confront the council and say, well, here's what I think you should be doing?
Yep.
Yeah. And how's that gone? All right. No, that's all. Thank you. Kia ora.
Okay.
Well, that's all from me.
Ahe,
Thank you, Mr. Rendell.
ka pai. Kia ora. Thank you.
Next we have Te Taiwhenua Here Taunga. I know Mare, we're a little bit running ahead of schedule. Is that okay?
Yeah, yep, so we're all done.
It possibly means that you've got a little bit more time, but I know that's a dangerous thing to say to you.
You've never given up at you more time.
And I think we've got pre-circulated a bit of summary from Murray Black, is that right?
Murray? Yeah, Murray.
Yep.
Yep. I've got that.
While I'm standing, I runga te whakaaro ko tahi anō te paita, huri ka teina tuakana, a te nohonga I runga te whakaaro ko tahi, a ko tai mai mātou, mātou ngā tani whao te tauwhenua Here Taunga. Kia me ki mātou nei waha kōrero I pāna me ki kia whakarite ai te kaupapa akai mo I tātou tarangi nei. Hoi anō mai ko koutou I te tainga mai, ara me ki tēnei taha, te kauni hera, ko koutou ngā kai tumi ana, tēnei te mei atu, kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora tātou. You've got a copy of...
Yes, we do.
Okay.
This is a 3-page summary.
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so... just 4 main issues I've raised in our summary. Around the freshwater management units. A hearings panel for plan change is required to make their decisions on the matters raised in those submissions and not be reliant on a process that is outside of their control. The hearings will be over before HBRC has decided what to do about freshwater management units on a regional basis. The NPS FM directs lower tier policy around FMUs. Not enabling FMUs within Plan Change 9 means that the plan change provisions and methods in the water management areas will need to promote the purpose of the Act in their own right, while prioritising the health and well-being of water above all other uses. This is a prerequisite whether HBRC has developed implementation pathways for Te Mana o Te Wai and FMUs or not. The water management areas in the Plan Change 9 schedules and rules fail to do this, as they enable the continuation of unsustainable abstraction and use of surface water and the mining of the Heretaunga aquifers. Te Tai Whenua o Heretaunga supplied a report under contract to HBRC for the Ngārororo River catchment that included specifics for 3 freshwater management units and values associated with these for the Ngārororo River. For the 4 tank catchments, we came up with around 12 freshwater management units. For the Ngārororo, from memory, it was down to Whanawhana from the headwaters, then down to Omahu, and then the rest of the awa, and similar approach for the Tutaikuri, 3 in there, and then the Karamu had 3 or 4, and then we had the aquifers separate freshwater management units. There's numerous consents coming up for renewal. This is for groundwater and surface water takes. They have specific conditions, including for some compliance with minimum flow restrictions. Now, I understand that the final decision hasn't been made on these yet by the hearings panel, and I note that from some of the other submitters that they want to retain the same minimum flow as proposed, whereas we are looking for elevation of those. And also around the consents that are coming up for renewal, or some that have already expired, while they are being considered for renewal, they have to comply with existing consent conditions. So the assessments of effects and the granting of consents to take and use groundwater were made subject to operative objectives and policies that existed at the time they were issued. These include Objective 44 and Policy 77D. Plan Change 9 seeks to remove these provisions and restrictions, as well as others, from applying in tank catchments, while allowing for the rollover of consents that were issued under them. This affects 600 expired consents to take groundwater, and numerous consents to take surface water. It also undermines their consent conditions as they are required to comply with the conditions of consent, but some of the RRMP provisions that these conditions are based on will no longer apply. Little control over numerous consents as a deletion of Chapter 5 sections from applying in tank catchments means that some conditions become null and void. The Section 42A and 42A addendum reports do not address the consequences of this. Actual and reasonable use. I've been sitting in on some of the hearings with some of the other submitters over a couple of weeks ago. Section 42A reports and commissioners have amended Plan Change 9 to allow for the maximum use over the last 10 years to apply to resource consents. This means that the 90 million cubic metre interim limit for groundwater takes from the Heretaunga groundwater resource can increase to up to 105 million. That was the 2020 year use, I think, in the definition for actual and reasonable use. Te Tai Whenua o Heretaunga still seek an abstraction limit of 70 million per annum from the Heretaunga Plains aquifer system, as the current abstractions are having adverse effects on surface water flows and are leading to steady decline in groundwater levels. And for somewhere around 900 litres per second depletion effects just on the Ngātaroto. For surface water, actual and reasonable use as specified in the glossary will replace the volumes that were founded on a scientific methodology, the Summer 7-day Q95. Actual and reasonable use is based on demand pressure and not on sustainable management of the resource or protecting in-stream habitat and life-supporting capacity of water, nor on providing for the relationships of Māori with freshwater resources. While I'm on that, I'd just like to make an additional comment on what's some of the things that are happening or seem to be happening now is, I did mention it in my evidence in chief. This was around, it's comparing apples with apples, I guess, but it's comparing the water requirements that consents for irrigating orchards were based on or issued under. So where they were issued to supply adequate water for 200, up to 200 trees per hectare, now we're talking about thousands of trees per hectare, which are with a huge increase in water. The older trees that we used to pick and dream about falling off our ladder, they used a certain amount of water, but they had a deep rooting system. The rootstock that they use now is shallow, so it requires constant watering during certain parts of the year. So the increase is phenomenal. Even though the same crop is being grown, it's just the intensified effects and the intensified use of water within the same area of land.
Yeah, I think we received quite a few submissions, certainly in week 2, and we've received some this week around the increase in the volume, not only of picking apples as an example, the intensity of apples, but also the shallow root system, which requires more water more often.
Yeah,
that
true.
was explained to us in some detail.
Yeah, okay. The Appendix 11 technical memo acknowledges that more water is coming out of the aquifers than is going in. So the groundwater resource and the surface waters that are being adversely affected due to groundwater pumping are degrading. Actual and reasonable use does not take into account nor avoid, remedy or mitigate such adverse effects. I'll just put a rider on that in terms of, I note that Zone 1 groundwater takes are being considered in minimum flow and surface water abstraction. Tikanga Māori and cultural relationships. Plan Change 9 trends towards enabling of economic opportunities in its current form. That's in reference to the addendum report, and the continued displacement of cultural values and practices in favour of abstractive uses for water, while water regulators consider what to do to minimise restrictions on such uses. The requirement to recognise and provide for Māori relationships with fresh water is a constant requirement which water managers have failed to address through Plan Change 9. Te Tai Whenua o Heretaunga have made amendments to the proposed plan, but the required amendments to ensure the active protection of Māori values and beliefs is difficult to achieve when the overriding focus of the plan is enabling unsustainable practice and water use to continue. The treaty principle of active protection, I think I supplied that in my evidence in chief. So there's 7 or 8 principles in schedules in the RRMP. The regional policy statement requires that when setting freshwater values, the schedule that contains the principles of the treaty are required to be taken into account. The treaty principle of active protection is not considered at a level where it has positive results for Māori and their cultural relationships and values associated with fresh water. Declining groundwater levels and diminished spring flows due to groundwater abstraction require positive action now rather than delaying things until a potential solution eventuates. Whether Tai Whenua sought elevation of the Māori value as a critical value in Plan Change 9 and schedules, while a Section 42A addendum report does not recommend any changes to cater for this. This is despite the operative RPS requiring avoidance, remediation or mitigation of any adverse effects on Māori due to activities that affect freshwater resources. Plan Change 9 still has the Māori value concept as being subservient to things like algae, where it is presumed that managing algal growth as a critical value will then cater for a healthy state of Māori. Neither does Plan Change 9 require the monitoring of Māori to ensure that adverse effects of activities on Māori are considered through consent application criteria, so such effects are managed appropriately. We have made some amendments to Plan Change 9 in this regard, although several objectives require the Māori of water to be maintained or improved, and I provide a list there in the footnote. That's some of them. Plan Change 9 does not provide a mechanism to ensure that this actually occurs. I'd just like to add one more thing before I'm subject to interrogation, and that's about there was an opportunity to provide a list of site visits or sites to visit. We've talked amongst ourselves. We have 3 that we think should be visited by the hearings panel at some stage. One is a place we call Ngā Puna, which is down Raupare Road. So there's a huge spring there emanating from the aquifer. We see it as a tohu of, I guess, aquifer condition in terms of if the flow from that puna can be maintained at a certain rate, well then we know that the aquifer is reasonably healthy. The other one is the old Roy's Hill recharge site out by one of the wineries. Where the river recharges, used to recharge artificially into the old rifle range ponds. I'd just like the commissioners to see the river out there and what's occurring. Also the Ohiti Pa site. Mare had some pictures of it at one of the other sessions. And very aware that with Ohiti Pa, it was there before they diverted the awa. So the area of the Pa extent, I guess, goes into the river, or goes into where the river is now. And some of the disruptions that's been caused to the river channel, well, it's like having graders and diggers, it's culturally offensive, I guess. So that's my submission, our submission at this stage. And have you got anything to add?
I just want to raise the matter insofar as models of co-governance and co-management. The question has been asked today, as I heard. I just want to bring to the attention of the commissioners, 20 years ago, within the Hastings District Council, upon a waste management site application out at East Clive, we ended up in the very same situation before commissioners. Went through the respective hearings, obviously, to the Environment Court, and it got all the way over to London before the Lords, before the Supreme Court came into effect, of Privy Council. And of course, the Lords of Privy Council said, well, why have you come all the way from the Southern Hemisphere to, in fact, just get across the table with each other and have this dialogue and conversation? Mark von Dadelson, who was acting on behalf of the Hastings District Council, along with Jeremy Dwyer, took it upon themselves to actually introduce the conversation back to the full council of Hastings, whereupon what then started to drive the relationship between tangata whenua that was being forged by both Ahuriri and Heretaunga Māori in regards to waste management from a tikanga perspective. And as Ngahi Tamona had provided evidence to say that at various hui, the proposition that was being put to the kaumātua insofar as don't just let Papa Tuanuku take care of all human waste. You need to bring in all the children. And in our whakapapa or aho matua, we have 70 children, of which elements of both wind, sun, and all the other deities that enable the human waste to actually become whakanoa. That principle was then put before the District Council, and then what came from it has been a very successful co-governance model that's operated within the Hastings District Council, and that's right under our nose. And so it was built on the very values of tikanga in regards to the genealogy of waste, kei te hea, and the process, if you can just picture in your mind's eye. And the best way I can give that as an example is a backyard toilet, that little house, where before flush toilets came in, our uncles, aunties, and all of those, and I'm sure maybe some of the older ones will remember this. That was a very central part of the backyard, and of course as that hole filled up, you moved the little house over to a new part, you filled that particular area up, and over 7 years, that whole process of the bad bugs were chewed up by the good bugs, which meant that about year 8 or year 9, our people would grow a tree on it. And so that modelling has been taken into what they call the biofilter trickling system over at Clive, whereby waste, Kate here, goes through the system, gets into these big tanks, and fortuitously, the whole process is quickened instead of going through 9 years. And of course, the outcome has been a far much better quality discharge into the bay. And the successive body of those that have been on the co-governance committee through the sciences that have been there have shown the result of that particular contamination level actually trending down. And so there is a successful model in terms of how a relationship can be given effect, that both the world of Te Ao Māori and its principles around tikanga, kaua, kaupapa Māori can actually go alongside of Western science. So just wanted to say that this has happened here, right under our noses. Kia ora.
Thank you. We're going to take some questions, but I just thought I'd just respond to the first matter, and that's just around the FMUs. A little bit later on this afternoon, we're going to be asking the council about where have they got up to with FMUs, and I understand council's been considering this matter, and it may be something that fits within the time frame of our hearing process and our deliberations. So we're quite interested in that, and we've had several submissions regards whether the scope of FMUs is within Plan Change 9 or not. So that's also something that we're considering. So just wanted to raise that as a point. I do have, this is perhaps a question for the council. It's just in regards to points 5 through 9. This is just in regards to the existing and expired consents, and it might be appropriate now or at some time in the very near future, just if you had a view in regards to that. That does seem different to what my current understanding is, but that's certainly, I'm not as appraised of these issues as you may be, just in regards to those consents.
Is it okay if we answer that tomorrow? Or do you want us to answer it now?
Tomorrow would be fine, yeah, it's just, I'm just raising that, so it's not really a question for the submitter, but it was certainly, while it's top of mind, it's a question that would be good to pick up for tomorrow. Thank you. And then just the last one, Mr. Sorry, was that a question?
I'll stand up, sorry. I've been asked to make it no, and that now would be good.
Well, they don't have an answer now, so that's I'd like an answer now, but they can't give it to us, so I've asked for it tomorrow. Okay. The next matter is just regards to point 10, and where it says section 42A reports and commissioners have amended Plan Change 9. We haven't amended proposed Plan Change 9. We haven't made a decision on the Plan Change yet.
Okay,
So
kia ora.
those amendments that have been put forward are from the council staff. But we'll open it up for questions.
Nothing from me now, just apart from that last point, Chair, that you were going to raise about commissioners have made no decisions on that or amendments to Plan Change proposal.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Black. Can I ask you what you mean by your paragraph 5 when you talk about the consents being rolled over? Like that's not my understanding at all. For instance, we had, I think Mr. Lowe was in here at one stage, and his present takes are about, his consent to take is 2.2 or 2.3 million cubic metres of water. His actual and reasonable use, his maximum use over the period he's had, the consents are about, and these numbers are from memory, about 800,000 cubic metres. He's not going to get his current consents rolled over
he will get his actual and reasonable use during that time, which is about a third of his current consented take. So what do you mean by rolled over in that context?
Well, when we were... Right, so the first thing is that the commissioners have yet to make their decision. I was listening to part of what Mr. Lowe was saying. He said there was one consent, I think, had a groundwater consent of 1 million cubic metres.
I can't
At
remember.
Whakatū, was that Whakatū?
I can't remember the exact.
Okay, that had been unutilised. And then it was around, he said something like, well, if we don't get the consent, we might have to move to another region, which I hear now and again around the country.
We've been at enough hearings where we hear lots of
Yeah. So there was that issue, but then he said there was a similar approach from Ms Blomfeld as well, with delegates, around 402, I think, hectares of development that was planned, but they had water available to use, but if that was taken off them, they would no longer have that water to develop. So I raise this in the context of the whole decision-making process, where you still have other submitters to hear, and just being aware that council's initial approach had been to roll over consents until 10 years or something after the plan change became operative.
I think the case is more that a whole lot of consents are on hold until these decisions are made. But certainly if a consent hasn't been exercised, then there's no, as I read the plan as proposed to us at the moment, putting aside what the submitters may desire, they won't get that water if they haven't used that consent. So I think the rolling over isn't an accurate portrayal, if you like, as to what will happen under the amended plan as recommended to us at the moment. That's not necessarily what we're going to accept, of course, but that's the status quo before us.
recognising there are a number of submitters who would like their consents to be rolled over.
Mare and I have been through numerous hearings where resource consent applicants have not fully utilised their consent before. They've used part of it, which means they've actioned the consent, and the council's approach has been they've already used part of it, therefore they can continue to have the full volume. And with Mr. Lowe's consent, he's used a wee bit of it. So how the commissioners determine whether the consent has been actioned or utilised, I guess you have to make a decision around that.
That will depend on our decisions.
Yeah, that's true. So I'm just here to try and influence rather
I think you
than...
mentioned some provisions in the RRMP.
A couple, yeah.
In your paragraph
6, 7, yeah.
But aren't they replaced by policies like policy 39, policy 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45?
They are replaced in part. I think what is occurring through this deletion or non-applicable sort of process for these chapters is that the whole plan loses its integrity. I mean the RPS and the RRMP, because if you look at some of those policies that are looking to be deleted, they are based on the RPS, whereas the new policies are not based on the RPS. So one example, I guess from memory, would be policy 75 in the RRMP. That refers to a specific provision in the RPS, whereas the new policies don't. So where things are based, the RPS refers to the Q95, the summer 7-day Q95, allocation policies in the operative plan are based on that, whereas when you change the definition or the method to actual and reasonable, that is not based on the RPS. So it creates a disconnection. It sort of brings into play a new method that is not based on any science or any sound technical process. All it is based on some sort of use that was applied over the last 10 years. And I'm all for it if it eventually creates a reduction in allocation, that'd be fine, because then we are working towards supporting the life-supporting capacity of water. But that is not assured at this stage.
I'm just scanning through those changes now and I'll have to read them more closely, but I certainly from a first scan of them, what they have removed, for instance, in table 9 from
Water quantity.
from those, they've simply taken out the minimum flows for the tank, this is a lovely word, the tank catchment minimum flows, and left them in for the Esk and the Nuhaka and etc., 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 Waimanu, and then they've been replaced in table 30 by table 31 in schedule 31 in the proposed plan change. So I haven't had a close look at that, but I will now that you've raised the issue. But on the face of it, just looking at one example, I can see it's certainly what's been taken out has been replaced.
I guess the integrity, like I said, the integrity behind table 9. Table 9 is based on specifies minimum flows, and then existing consent conditions require, and the RPS require, that when minimum flows are reached, abstraction will cease. This is for surface water. But the new plan is enabling, I think, 10% more water take to the, not for rootstock survival and things like that.
Well, it comes up against a hard ceiling of 90 million cubes, the way it is at the moment. What the then is are potential opportunities to retain stock water takes. And potentially take small amounts of water for rootstock survival. So there's a specific policy in the Tuki catchment that provides for that.
Right.
But that's 20 cubic metres a day as a maximum, the way it's written at the moment.
For rootstock survival.
Yes. Now, I'm not quite sure how that operates or would operate, but that's the proposal at the moment, that would be in effect, as I understand it, a permitted activity.
This is why I mentioned the comparison between 200 trees per hectare and 12 to 12, up to 1,200 trees per hectare, which have a very vigorous root system. So rootstock survival for 1,200 trees is a lot more than rootstock survival for 200 trees. And everyone's they're going in everywhere now.
I think I'm not speaking for others, speaking for myself. I accept that, which is why I said I still have some issues with how that would work. And if, how can I put it, there are additional demands that have come across, for instance, by planting higher density of stock, of plants, not stock, higher density of plants, how that is provided for, and does that again come up, is that a hard ceiling matter, or would they have to apply for consent at that sort of, if they want to take more water than might reasonably be required to meet current demand. So it's a very live issue, at least in my mind, as to how that would work.
I think there's also an existing consent is for an existing activity and use, whereas Plan Change 9 enables a change of land use, which then could trigger a change of water requirement.
It allows a change of land use in terms of nitrogen leaching rates. Any other change of land use could only roll over. There exists, sorry, not roll over, that's not the right word, could only have enough water to meet their actual and reasonable demand, or the alternative limb of meeting Iricalc for that actual and reasonable.
Which I think you yourself have said Iricalc overestimates water requirements.
It's not the view of Dr. Dark, but I think it's a reasonably commonly held view. I think, like any model, it's probably getting better over time, but no model's perfect.
And he did highlight a few issues with it as well. You killed it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming in again. Much appreciated.
Cheers. See you next time.
Yes. We might get to a stage where we're actually able to fill in the words before they've even been spoken. We have Mr. Matt Edwards, who was our next submitter. Mr. Edwards, welcome. Yes. We're just going to bring up your submission.
It shouldn't take long, it's not very big.
It's one of our first ones. Well, good afternoon, Mr. Edwards. We're happy to hear your submission. Now, we've read your submission. We're happy for you to focus us in on some particular points that you wanted to make. Maybe even tell us a little bit about your business. That would be helpful. Thank you.
Well, I am a fruit grower and I do hold a resource consent.
Which kinds of fruit?
Kiwi fruit.
And how much land and where, please?
There's a hectare in kiwi fruit, but the actual block size is 4.
And whereabouts?
In the Miani area.
Okay,
Thank you.
It's quite some time since I read through the material that was available on the web, and I didn't look at it all because it's large. But from that, and I haven't kept up to date with all the changes that have been going on subsequently, but from my reading of that, I make a few comments. Some things I agree with and where things are proposed to head, which I've outlined at the beginning of my submission. I think it's a good move to annual allocations rather than for, as it exists at the moment, a shorter time interval, because it gives more flexibility to people to use that water in a better way given the conditions that might prevail. In reducing the allowance of 20 cubic metres a day, I regarded that as just an allowance for stock, garden watering and whatnot. I didn't see that applying to keeping rootstock alive. And if that was all it was for, I can't see a problem with going down to 5 cubic metres a day for just incidental use. And I agree with the aim of making more efficient use of the water that is available by requiring the most efficient use of that water in the way that it is applied. But there are some things that I don't agree with that are proposed, and one is telemetry for all resource consent holders taking above 5 litres a second. I don't see that this is necessary. I see it as a nice thing to have for the regional council as long as someone else pays for it. But from my perspective, I don't want additional costs, because once you start that, you have never-ending payments to keep that system going. And I think, and given the size of the aquifer and the use, it is pretty easy for regional council to predict where things are going to go. I don't think they need up-to-the-minute reporting. They get it every month as it is by email, and I think that's quite adequate for the smaller users like myself. Sure, I agree it's okay for the big users, you do need it, but I don't think everybody should be required to do that. The other thing I would say is, in the information that was provided, it was suggested that there wouldn't be enough water once in 20 years. Well, what are orchardists and crop growers going to do if there's not enough water in that 20-year situation? I'd suggest they're going to take it, whether they're allowed to or not, because they're not going to let crops die. So I don't think that's a sensible suggestion that we don't have enough water once in 20 years. In relation to the other points in my submission, what we're really talking about here is the water pie of 90 million cubic metres of water available for use. Whether that's right or wrong doesn't really matter. We've got to work on a figure that's the best we can get. So that's one of the pies that we're talking about, the available water. The other pie is the economic pie. And I would think that in Hawke's Bay, the economic pie largely derives from the use of water in the production of food crops. And where this whole thing is heading is for a reduction in the amount of water available to the food producers to make more available for the urban dwellers and other uses. And to me, that is completely the wrong direction to be heading in. Our population is increasing, and that's why there's pressure on the water resources. And so, if you don't increase the size of your economic pie, you're all going to get a bit less, or we're all going to get a bit less. So if we want a reduction in the standard of our living, then this is the way to do it. I think the sensible way is that the water pie of 90 million cubic metres a year, if anything, needs to be cut the other way. It needs to be cut in making more water available for economic production rather than reducing it. And so that means that the urban dwellers would need to take a cut under that scenario. And I don't see in any of the literature that I've read where they're being asked to really make any sacrifices. It's all on the rural production. So what I would like to suggest is, and I have put this in the suggestions, is that we need to make the best use of the resource that we've got at the moment. And there's a huge amount of water being wasted. So it's difficult to do things around the aquifer because we can't stop that water going out to sea. It's going out to sea big time at the moment while it's wet through the winter time. But how about town dwellers, where possible, being asked to collect some of the water that's available rather than it going down the stormwater systems in a tank that they could use for garden watering and car washing and so on. This happens overseas. Why aren't we doing it? Another way to reduce the demand on the resource is the water bottling scenario. And they've got their consents for extended periods at the moment, but surely they should not be renewed when they come up for renewal if there is a problem with supply of water, which there seems to be, because we're told the resource is over-allocated. There's a lot of water in New Zealand going out to sea not being used. And so I don't see why these people shouldn't go elsewhere and get that water that's going to waste in those places. The other way that we can have more water available for the future is through augmentation, but that's going to cost. So these are the things that we are facing. If there's no way that we're going to be able to reduce the population growing, so there's going to be more pressure on the water. So maybe augmentation has to be developed in time. But at the moment, hopefully through better use of the water that we do have, we won't need to move to that yet. But the regional council's going to face a huge problem, I think, with finance, with the things that they are confronted with. And we're looking at effectively about a 40% increase in rates to fund some of the things they want to do in the next few years. But then if we're looking at augmentation, that's going to cost. And we're looking at sea level rise, and that's going to cost heaps. So there's a real crisis coming, as I see it. But by making sensible use of the water that we have got and cutting back where we can, then maybe we'll get by without having to spend money on augmentation at the moment. But if the problem is so bad at the moment that consents can't be issued, then maybe augmentation does need to get into gear and get going. The other thing I would like to say is around resource consents, I'm not fully utilising the consent I have, but I'm not using all the land that I have. And I guess other people will be in that situation, but if we want to make changes in the future and we're tied down to set amounts based on what we're doing at the moment, how are we going to make those changes without applying for a new consent? And I think there needs to be a mechanism whereby food producers can get more water relatively easily if they can justify it. There needs to be a buffer in there, I think, in the way things are done. Because if we get tied down to set conditions for 15 years or whatever period the consents run for, then it just hinders economic development. So those are the choices that the community faces. We either have enough water for everyone or we don't. But if we don't, there are going to be issues over the economic development here in the bay, and water will stifle it if there's not enough. And I think the council has done a study in this area and know that out to 2050, if the restrictions that are imposed and proposed under this are implemented, it's going to have about $150 million economic hit. So that's my comments on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. Has anyone got any questions?
Just curious to know, you said you had a consent. What does that consent, how much water does it permit you to take?
I think it's about 3,800 cubic metres a month.
What does that work out as a rate per second, do you know?
It's somewhere around 20 litres a second.
Okay.
Is what I work on.
That sounds like quite a lot of water for 4 hectares. Would you, well, put it this way, you've got 1 hectare in...
Well, as I say, I don't use it all.
No, you've got 1 hectare in kiwi fruit.
Yeah.
How much water does that 1 hectare of kiwi fruit require during the peak of the summer?
Well, put it this way, over about 18 years I've taken about 100,000 cubic metres.
That doesn't really answer my question, but...
Well, on average that means something like a bit over 5,000 cubic metres a season. Roughly. It's also available for frost fighting, but that doesn't happen very often.
The kiwi fruit, are they, as crops go, are they have a high demand for water? Let's say compared to pip fruit or grapes?
All I know is that if I don't water them, the fruit will suffer. And I need to keep a reasonable level of ground moisture there. But I don't put on water willy-nilly because it costs.
Is your consent telemated at the moment, or is it metered?
It's metered, but it's not on telemetry. All consents over 5 litres a second are metered, or should be. And that's been a requirement for the level that we take at since 2014, but we do not have 10 years of records of take, which was another thing in the proposals, that actual and reasonable be determined on 10 years of records, but they don't exist in our stage. We were not required to be metered until 2014, the end of 2014.
Or it's the highest use in a year, which presumably was last year.
Sorry?
Or it's the highest use in any given year, which presumably was last summer.
I don't know what my highest use per year has been offhand.
No further questions, thank you.
No, we didn't have any further questions. Thank you. We've got a little break now till 3:40 and our last submitter, Hawke's Bay District Health Board.